Chapter 9, Logic and the Principle of the Economy of Thought. 52 Introductory. We now turn to another empiricistic attempt to find a basis for logic and epistemology, closely related to the psychologism which we have hitherto sought to refute, and which has won wide acceptance in recent years. The attempt to provide a biological basis for these disciplines, either through the principle of least action, as Avenouris styles it, or through the principle of the economy of thought, as Mack calls it. That this new tendency ends up by being a psychologism, is made very clear in the Psychology of Cornelius. In that work the principle in question is expressly given the position of the basic law of the understanding, of the universal, basic law of psychology, H. Cornelius, Psychology, pp 82-86. Psychology, the psychology of cognitive processes in particular, when built upon this basis, will also yield us the foundations of all philosophy, opposite pp 3-9. It seems to me that, by these theories of thought economy, ideas well justified and fruitful in their due limits, are given a twist that, if universally accepted, would entail the corruption of all genuine logic and epistemology, as well as of all psychology. We shall first consider the principle of Avenouris and Mack in the teleological guise of a principle of adaptation. In this we shall see its worthwhile content, and the justified goal of the investigations that might spring from it, both in psychological anthropology and the practical theory of science. We shall go on to show how little it is able to provide foundations for psychology, or to assist us in pure logic and the theory of knowledge. 53. The teleological character of the principle of Mack and Avenouris and the scientific meaning of an economy of thought, denkoeconomic. However we may express our principle, it is a principle of evolution or adaptation. Its concern is to conceive science as the most purposive, economical, power-saving, adaptation of thought to the varied fields of phenomena. Avenouris, in the preface to his Habilitation Schrift, Philosophy has thought about the world according to the principle of least action. Prolegomena to a critique of pure experience, Leipzig, 1876, P. Thrift, expresses his principle as follows: the change imposed by the mind on its presentations when new impressions enter, is always the least possible. Immediately afterwards he says, since the mind is subject to the conditions of organic existence and its purposive demands, the principle cited becomes a principle of development. The mind uses only as much energy as it needs to use in an apperception, and, where there are many possible apperceptions, prefers that one which achieves more with the same expenditure of energy. In favorable circumstances, the mind even prefers a temporary spurt of effort, to a momentary reduction of energy, with which, however, a lesser effectiveness or duration of effect would be connected, a temporary spurt which promises so many more, and so much longer enduring, effective advantages. The increase in abstraction, due to Avenouris's introduction of the notion of a perception, with all its sweeping vagueness and emptiness, is dearly bought. Mack rightly gives a central position to a fact which in Avenouris seems the outcome of tortuous and generally dubious deductions, the fact that science achieves as complete an orientation as possible in each relevant empirical field, and also the most economical of possible adjustments of thought to such a field. He is further not fond, and quite rightly, of speaking of a principle, but simply of the economical character of scientific research, of the thought economies achieved by concepts, formulae, theories, methods, etc. We have not therefore to do, in the case before us, with a principle in the sense of a rational theory, with an exact law capable of functioning as the ground for a rational explanation, as the laws of pure mathematics or of mathematical physics can function, but with one of those valuable teleological 11 new points, which are of great use in the biological sciences in general, and which may all be attached to the general notion of development. The relation to self-preservation and preservation of the species is obvious. Animal actions are determined by presentations and judgments, and if these were insufficiently adapted to the course of events, if past experience could not be put to use, if novelties could not be anticipated, means and ends not properly adjusted, at least on an average, in the life situations of the individuals concerned, and in relation to threats of injury and advantageous utilities, their self-preservation would not be possible. A creature resembling man, but who only experienced sense contents, who formed no associative and no imaginative habits, and who accordingly lacked all capacity to interpret sense contents objectively, to perceive external things and events, to anticipate them through custom, or reconstitute them in memory, and who could not rely on average success in all these acts of experience, how could such a creature survive? Even Hume spoke in this connection of a sort of pre-established harmony between the course of nature and the sequence of our ideas. An enquiry concerning human understanding, Sect V, Part N, and the modern theory of development has prompted further pursuit of this viewpoint, as well as detailed investigation of the relevant teleologies of our mental constitution. It will without doubt be a point of view as fruitful for psychological biology as it has long been for physical biology. This viewpoint not only presides over the sphere of blind thinking, but also over the sphere of logical, of scientific thinking. Man's superiority lies in his intelligence. He is not solely a being who brings perception and experience to bear on external situations, he also thinks, employs concepts, to overcome the narrow limits of his intuition. Through conceptual knowledge he penetrates to rigorous causal laws, which permit him to foresee the course of future phenomena, to reconstruct the course of past phenomena, to calculate the possible reactions of environing things in advance, and to dominate them practically, and all this to a vastly greater extent, and with vastly more confidence, than would otherwise be possible. Science dou prevoyance, prevoyance dou action, as Comte tellingly remarks. Whatever misery the one-sidedly overstrained yearning to know may bring to the individual thinker, and that not seldom, the fruits, the treasures of science ultimately accrue to the whole of humanity. In what we have said the economy of thought has not as yet been mentioned. This notion, however, crops up as soon as we go into the question of what the notion of adaptation involves. A creature obviously will have a more purposive constitution, be better adapted to its living conditions, the more rapidly it can perform the acts needed for, or favorable to, its own maintenance, and the less energy it expends on such performance. It will become more quickly ready for, and more successful in avoiding the injuries, or pursuing the advantages, that occur with a certain average frequency in a given sphere. It will also pile up a larger stock of superfluous power to avoid new injuries or compass new advantages. We are of course only dealing here with vague, roughly coordinated, roughly accessible relations. They are nonetheless such as can be talked of with sufficient definiteness, and can, at least in certain fields, be instructively, if sketchily, weighed. This is certainly true of the field of mental performances. Having recognized them as promoting survival, one can treat them from an economic standpoint, and can test men's actual performances from a teleological angle. One can also, so to speak, a priori, show certain excellences to be demanded 15 by an economy of thought, and then show them to be realized in the forms and manners of our thought procedures, whether in general, or in advanced minds, or in the methods of scientific research. We have here, in any case, a field of extensive, rewarding, instructive investigations. The field of mind is a subfield of biology, and accordingly has room, not merely for abstract psychological researches, aimed, like physical researches, at elementary laws, but also for concrete, psychological investigations, and, in particular, for teleological ones. The latter make up mental anthropology as the necessary counterpart of physical anthropology. They deal with man in the living human community, as well as in the wider community of all life on Earth. 54. Closer treatment of the justified ends of an economy of thought, in the sphere, mainly, of purely deductive methodology. Its relation to a logical technology. The standpoint of a thought economy, applied especially to the sphere of science, may achieve important results. It may throw clear light on the anthropological grounds of varying methods of research. Many of the most fruitful and characteristic methods of the most advanced sciences only achieve satisfactory intelligibility if we look to the peculiarities of our mental constitution. As Mach excellently remarks on this point, to do mathematics without achieving clearness in this regard is often to have the disagreeable impression that one's paper and pencil are cleverer than oneself. The following points merit consideration. Men's intellectual powers are severely limited, and there is, in particular, a narrow sphere within which complex, abstract notions can be fully understood. There is also a vast effort involved in the mere understanding of genuine complexities of this sort. We are also similarly restricted in our genuine grasp of the sense of even moderately complex propositional combinations, and even more restricted in our power to grasp and genuinely carry out deductions of even moderate complexity. The sphere in which active research originally moves in full comprehension, and operating with the thoughts themselves, is a fortiori small one. When all these facts are considered, it is quite astonishing that the more comprehensive rational theories and sciences should have been developed at all. It is, for example, a most serious problem how mathematical disciplines are possible, disciplines not conducted in terms of relatively simple thoughts, but in which veritably towering thought piles, and thought combinations intertwined in 1,000 ways, are moved about with the most sovereign freedom, and are spawned in ever-increasing intricacy by our researches. All this is due to art and method. They overcome the defects of our mental constitution, and permit an indirect achievement by way of symbolic processes from which the intuitive element, as well as all true understanding and inner evidence are absent, but which are rendered secure because a general proof of the efficiency of the method has been once and for all guaranteed. All the arts which belong here, and which are generally had in mind when there is talk of method in a certain pointed sense, have the character of devices which economize thought. They arise in history, and in the individual case, out of certain natural processes of thought economy. The thinker's practical reflection makes him see the advantages of these processes. They are then perfected in full consciousness, and artificially constructed, and they are thus made into more complex but infinitely more efficient pieces of machinery than the natural processes ever were. Following such a path of insight, and with constant reference to the peculiarities of our mental constitution, the pioneers of research discover methods which they justify once and for all. When this has been done, such methods can be used without insight, so to say mechanically. In each given case, an objectively correct result is assured. This far-reaching reduction of insight to mechanism in our thought processes leads to an indirect mastery over those endlessly winding paths of thought that admit of no direct mastery. Such a reduction rests on the psychological nature of signative symbolic thinking. It plays an immeasurable role in the construction of blind mechanisms, for example the rules for the 4 arithmetical operations, and for higher operations with decimals, where a result emerges, perhaps with the help of logarithmic or geometric functional tables, but without assistance from insight. But it also plays a part in contexts where insight guides our researches and our proofs. We might mention here, for example, the remarkable duplication of all concepts of pure mathematics, and in particular those of arithmetic, so that the original arithmetical signs which at first signify the correlated number concepts, with which definition has connected them, subsequently function as merely operational signs, whose meaning is wholly determined by external types of operation, each sign counting as a mere something or other to which this or that definite thing can be done on paper. 4. These surrogative, operational concepts which turn signs into a kind of counters, preside exclusively over the most extensive fields of arithmetical thought and research. They represent a vast easing of the latter. They take them down from the exhausting heights of abstraction to comfortable, intuitive ways, where imagination, guided by insight, can move, within the limits of rules, with freedom and with relative effortlessly, as in regulated games. One should point, in this connection, to the revolutionary thought economy which occurs in the purely mathematical disciplines, when genuine thought is replaced by surrogative, signative thinking, an economy which leads imperceptibly to formal generalizations of our original thought trains, and even of our sciences. In this manner, almost without specially directed mental labor, deductive disciplines arise having an infinitely enlarged horizon. Out of arithmetic, the original theory of numbers and numerical magnitudes, a generalized, formal arithmetic arises in more or less spontaneous fashion. In this numbers and magnitudes no longer count as basic concepts, but merely as chance objects of application. Fully conscious reflection now takes over, and the pure theory of manifolds emerges as a further extension. In its form this covers all possible deductive systems. The form system of formal arithmetic is merely one of its special instances. See under this head some points in chapter X1, 69, 70. To analyze these and like types of method, and fully to clarify their achievement, is perhaps the most beautiful and least developed field in the theory of science, the extremely important, instructive theory of deductive method, of mathematical method in the widest sense. We do not of course get to do this through mere generalities, through vague talk of the surrogative function of signs, of mechanisms which save energy etc. Deep-going analyses are everywhere needed. Each typically different method must be genuinely investigated, and its economic achievement actually shown and precisely explained. Once the meaning of the task here set us has been clearly grasped, the problems of an economy of thought in pre-scientific or extra-scientific thinking also acquire new light and a new form. Survival requires a certain adaptation to external nature. It demands, we said, the capacity to judge things more or less rightly, to foresee the course of events, to assess causal consequences correctly etc. Real knowledge of all this is achieved first, if at all, in science. But how can we in practice judge and infer without the insight which only science, the possession of so few, can offer? The practical needs of pre-scientific life are subserved by many highly complex, efficient procedures. One need only think of the decimal system of numbers. If they are not discovered by insight, but naturally developed, one must ponder the question of their possibility, as to how the operation of blind mechanism can coincide in outcome with the demands of insight. Considerations such as those indicated above show us the way. To throw light on the teleology of pre-scientific or extra-scientific procedures, one must first carefully analyze the combinations of presentations and judgments in question, and the dispositions at work. One must establish the actual facts, the psychological mechanism of the thought procedure in question. The economy of thought achieved is made plain when we show our procedure to be one whose results can, in logically perspicuous fashion, be indirectly proved to accord with the truth, whether of necessity, or with a certain, not too small, probability. If the natural origin of the machinery which economizes thought is not to remain a miracle, or, what is the same, a product of a peculiar, creative act of divine intelligence, we shall have to start with a careful analysis of the naturally dominant circumstances and motives of the ordinary man's ideas, perhaps of a savage's or animal's ideas, and show on this basis how a procedure which has had such success could and must have issued spontaneously out of purely natural causes. 5 In this manner, the idea of an economy of thought, which to me seems well justified and finitful, has been given some definiteness and clarity. We have given an outline of the problem that it must solve, and the main parts that it must enter upon. Its relation to logic, in the practical sense of a technology of knowledge, is immediately understandable. It plainly yields an important foundation for such a technology. It gives essential aids towards constituting the idea of technical methods of human knowledge, towards useful specifications of such methods, and to the deduction of rules for their assessment and discovery. 55. The meaninglessness of an economy of thought for pure logic and epistemology, and its relation to psychology. To the extent that these thoughts coincide with those of Avenouris and Emack, we have no differences. I gladly agree with them. I am genuinely convinced, in particular, that we owe a vast amount of logical illumination to the historical methodological labors of Emack, and that this is the case where one cannot altogether, or altogether cannot, agree with his conclusions. Emack, unfortunately, does not seem to me to have tackled the most fruitful problems of the economy of thought, the problems I tried to formulate above in a somewhat brief but quite sufficient fashion. His failure to do this is, in any case, partly due to the epistemological misinterpretations that he thought of as necessary foundations for his investigations. Mack's writings have, however, had an immense influence in respect of these very misinterpretations. This is a side of his thought that he shares with Avenouris, in respect of which I must here oppose him. Mack's doctrine of an economy of thought, like Avenouris's doctrine of least action, relates, as we saw, to certain biological facts. Ultimately we are dealing with a branch of the theory of evolution. This fact makes plain why such researches throw light on practical epistemology, on the methodology of scientific research, but not at all on pure epistemology, and especially not on the ideal laws of pure logic. Per contra, the writings of the school of Mack and Avenouris seem to aim at an epistemology rooted in an economy of thought. Against such a conception, or such a use of the economy of thought, we must train the whole arsenal of objections which we above opposed to psychologism and relativism. Attempts to found epistemology on an economy of thought ultimately reduce to attempts to found it on psychology. We need not here repeat, nor specially apply, our arguments. Cornelius increases the plain incongruities of his case by endeavoring to derive elementary psychological laws from a teleological principle of mental anthropology, which itself presupposes and is derived from these facts. He also tries, through the instrumentality of psychology, to provide an epistemological foundation for philosophy. This so-called principle, I must further remark, is not at all an ultimate, explanatory, rational principle, but a mere assemblage, a mass of facts regarding adaptation, facts ideally in need of an ultimate reduction to elementary facts and laws, whether we are able to provide such or not. To underpin psychology with teleological principles as its basic laws, principles devised to explain our varied mental functions, does not promise much for the progress of the science. No doubt it is instructive to point out the teleological significance of our mental functions, and of our more important mental structures, to show in detail, therefore, how and why the actually formed combinations of our mental elements have the utilitarian relation to survival that we expect a priori. But to treat the descriptively given facts as necessary consequences of such principles, so as to seem to be giving a real explanation of these facts, and that particularly in contexts whose main aim is to lay bare the last foundations of psychology, all this can only breed confusion. A psychological or epistemological law concerned with an endeavor to achieve as much as possible in this or that respect, is a chimera. In the pure sphere of fact, there is no maximum possibility, in the sphere of law no endeavor. What happens in each case, as psychological matter of fact, is quite definite, there is so much of it and no more. The factual element in the principle of economy reduces to the fact that there are such things as presentations, judgments and other thought experiences, which are further connected with feelings that, in the form of pleasure, promote certain directions of thought formation, in the form of pain, discourage them. One can then assert, with rough generality, the existence of a progressive formation of presentations and judgments which lead first to the formation of single experiences, Erfahrungen, out of originally senseless elements, and then to the combination of such experiences into a single, more or less orderly, unity of experience. Psychological laws determine the emergence, out of our first roughly agreeing mental collocations, of the presentation of the single world common to everyone, and of an empirically blind belief in its existence. One should, however, note that this world is not the same for everyone, but only so on the whole. It is the same only to an extent which affords a sufficient practical guarantee for our common presentations and actions. It is not the same for the ordinary man and the scientific research worker. For the former it is a system merely approximate in its regularity, and shot through with countless accidents, whereas for the latter it is a nature ruled throughout by absolutely strict law. It is plainly an undertaking of great scientific import to show up the psychological ways and means through which the idea of a world as an object of experience, an idea sufficient for the needs of practical life and for survival, should have been developed and established, and, following this, to show up the psychological ways and means through which an objectively adequate idea of a unified experience should have grown up in the minds of scientific research workers, the idea of a unified experience governed by strict laws, and embracing an ever-enriched scientific content. This whole investigation is, however, irrelevant to epistemology. It can only have a highly indirect use for the latter, in assisting us to criticize epistemological prejudices, in whose case psychological motives really count. The question is not how experience, whether naive or scientific, arises, but what must be its content if it is to have objective validity. We must ask on what ideal elements and laws such objective validity of knowledge of the real is founded, more generally, on what any knowledge is founded, and how the performance involved in knowledge should be properly understood. We are, in other words, not interested in the origins and changes of our world presentation, but in the objective right which the world presentation of science claims as against any other world presentation, which leads it to call its world the objectively true one. Psychology looks for perspicuous explanations of the formation of world presentations. World science, the sum total of the different sciences of the real, wishes to know perspicuously what obtains in reality, what makes up the true, the actual world. Epistemology, however, wishes to grasp perspicuously, from an objectively ideal standpoint, in what the possibility of perspicuous knowledge of the real consists, the possibility of science and of knowledge in general. 56. Continuation. The OET-POF 1 RP6T-POF involved in any foundation of pure logic on an economy of thought we seem, in the case of the principle of economy, to be dealing with an epistemological or a psychological principle. This appearance mainly stems from confusion between the factually given and the logically ideal, the former being tacitly substituted for the latter. We perspicuously see it to be the supreme goal, the ideally justified drift of all explanation which transcends mere description, that it should arrange facts which are in themselves blind, facts at first found in a conceptually delimited field, under laws which are as general as possible, and that it should in this sense bring them together with the maximum possible rationality. This maximization of the work of bringing together is here quite clear. It is the ideal of a pervasive, all-embracing rationality. If all matters of fact obey laws, there must be some minimum set of laws, of the highest generality and maximum deductive independence, from which all other laws can, by mere deduction, be derived. These basic laws are, accordingly, laws of supreme coverage and efficacy, whose knowledge yields the absolute maximum of insight in some field, which permits the explanation of all that is in any way explicable in that field. Idealizing the matter, we here assume that there are no limits to our power to deduce and subsume. In this manner the axioms of geometry are basic laws explaining and covering all the facts of space. Through them every general spatial truth, i.e. every geometrical truth, achieves a self-evident reduction to its final explanatory grounds. This goal or principle of maximum rationality we recognize with insight to be the supreme goal of the rational sciences. It is self-evident that it would be better for us to know laws more general than those which, at a given time, we already possess, for such laws would lead us back to grounds deeper and more embracing. Plainly, however, our principle is no mere biological principle, or principle of thought economy, it is a purely ideal principle, an eminently normative one. It accordingly permits no resolution or reinterpretation into facts of our mental life, or the life of human society. To identify the drift towards maximum possible rationality with the drift towards biological adaptation, or to derive it from the latter, to saddle it in addition with the function of a basic mental force, all this is a mass of confusions only paralleled by the psychologistic misreadings of the laws of logic, and their conception as laws of nature. To say that our mental life is in fact swayed by this principle is to run counter to obvious truth. Our actual thinking does not in fact conform to its ideals, as if ideals were some sort of natural forces. The ideal drift of logical thinking is as such towards rationality. The thought economist, sit venia verbo, turns it into a dominant real drift of human thought, bases it on the vague principle of power saving, and ultimately on adaptation, and imagines that he has cleared up the norm that we should think rationally, has explained the objective sense and worth of rational science in general. Certainly one is justified in talking of an economy in thinking, of an economy of thought in the embrace of facts by general propositions, of subordinate generalizations by higher ones, and the like. One is, however, only justified in that one compares one's actual thought with a perspicuously recognized ideal norm, which is accordingly RP 6T POF T, CPVCRE1. The ideal validity of this norm is presupposed by all meaningful talk of an economy of thinking. It is not therefore a possible explanatory outcome of a theory of such economy. We measure our empirical by our ideal thinking, and we then say that the former to some extent runs as if guided by insight into these ideal principles. We are accordingly right in speaking of a natural teleology of our mental organization, according to which our presentations and judgments proceed on the whole, i.e. proceed sufficiently for the average advantage of living, as if they were logically governed. With the exception of the few cases of truly perspicuous thinking, thought bears in itself no hallmark of logical validity. It is not intrinsically perspicuous, nor purposively, if indirectly, steered by prior insight. As a matter of fact, thought achieves a certain show of rationality, to an extent which allows us thought economists, reflecting on the ways of our empirical thinking, to prove perspicuously that such ways must lead to results that, roughly and on an average, coincide with those of strict logic. We have in fact discussed the matter above. The VCRT POF RP6T POF is therefore unmasked. Before all economizing of thought, we must already know our ideal, we must know what science ideally aims at, what law-governed connections, what basic laws and derived laws etc., ideally are and do, before we can discuss and assess the thought economical function of knowing them. Certainly we have vague notions of these ideas before we explore them scientifically, and so we can talk of economizing thought even before a science of pure logic is constructed. But the essential fact is not changed thereby. Pure logic is in itself prior to all such thought economics, and it remains absurd to base the former on the latter. One last point. Naturally all scientific grasp and explanation proceeds on psychological laws, in the sense of a thought economics. It is, however, an error to think that one can therefore play down the distinction between logical and natural thought, that one can treat scientific activity as a mere continuation of natural, blind activity. One may, though it is not quite unobjectionable, talk of natural as well as logical theories. But one must not forget that a logical theory in no sense does the same thing as a natural one, or only does this in a higher manner. It has not the same aim, or rather, it has an aim, which we for the first time import into the natural theory. We measure, as shown above, certain natural thought processes, by which we here mean processes lacking insight, by comparing them to logical theories properly so called, and we call such thought processes natural theories, since they have certain psychological fruits which are just as they would be if they were really theories, the logical products of perspicuous thought. Our nomenclature, however, leads us into the error of attributing the essential traits of actual theories to such natural ones, to the seeing of authentic theory, as it were, in the latter. These analogues of theories may, as mental processes, be very similar to actual theories, but they remain basically different. A logical theory is a theory on account of the ideal, necessary connection that dominates it, while what is here called a natural theory is a mere course of chance presentations or convictions, not tied together by insight, without binding power, but which has for the most part a utility in practice, just as if it has a theoretical basis. The errors of this trend toward thought economics are due in the end to the fact that those who go with it, like all psychologistic thinkers, have an interest in knowledge which stops short at the empirical side of science. They fail in a certain manner to see the wood for the mere trees. They concern themselves with science as a biological phenomenon, and do not see that they are touching upon the epistemological problem of science as ideally unified, objective truth. The epistemology of the past, which still reckoned the ideal among its problems, seems to them an error. It can only be made a worthy object of scientific concern for them in one fashion, by showing it to have had, relatively speaking, the function of economizing thought at a more profound level of philosophical thinking. But the more that it becomes a philosophical fashion to judge the main drifts of epistemology in this manner, the more must research protest against it, and the more necessary it is to discuss the basic points of dispute in as many-sided a manner as possible. We must, in particular, go as deep as we can into the basically different thought trends in the spheres of the ideal and the real, thereby opening the way for that perspicuous clarification which is the presupposition for a final foundation of philosophy. The present work is a small contribution towards this end.